Right, we'll start, because I've got it as being about 9 o'clock. Obviously what you want at this time of the day, 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, is murder and incest. And suicide, actually, which is what you get in Oedipus Rex.
Molestation.
Yeah, absolutely. You get all kinds of physical self-mutilation,
Yes.
you know, it's got it all. This is the kind of thing you come to university to look at. Aristotle and Sophocles in one go. So this is the stuff you can show off about so much, that you know this. So we're going to look at Aristotle's concept of dramatic convention, and we're going to illustrate it through Oedipus Rex, because Aristotle was a bit of a fan of Oedipus Rex. First thing about the poetics themselves, they are not the complete work. With so much of Aristotle, what we have actually is his lecture notes rather than the finished things. Famously, Book 2 of the Poetics has been missing for centuries, or millennia, really, because Book 2 is the bit on comedy. We've got the bit of tragedy, and we've got a few things about comedy, but most of what we have is actually, or most of the stuff on comedy is no longer available to us. So we have to try and work that out in other ways. I suppose the first thing to ask is, what is a tragedy? What makes a tragedy? Any ideas? Yeah, that's one aspect of it, absolutely. I'm glad you didn't say that it's sad, or that people die, which is the usual way of people thinking about tragedy. You say the word tragic all the time, but I think that's much better. It's when someone perhaps thinks they're doing something right or good, but it's actually having a sort of negative or harmful effect. That's certainly one aspect of it, and that comes under the rubric of dramatic irony. But the usual rule for tragedy is that at the end of tragedy, everyone dies. At the end of comedy, everyone gets married. But this is not really a kind of working thesis. So we're going to look at what makes tragedy, and then when people say, "Oh, that's so tragic," for example, when a puppy dies or something like that, you say, "No, that's not tragic," unless that puppy had slept with its own mother and killed its father, which in the animal kingdom is not actually that rare. Then it's not really a tragedy, unless that puppy was a kind of lofty ruler of a Greek city-state. Then it's not a tragedy. So we want to find out exactly what makes tragedy. And tragedy has a formula, which is the nice thing about tragedy. You can say this plus this plus this plus this equals tragedy. That's why Aristotle looks at it, because that's what Aristotle does with everything. He looks at things and he dissects them into their constituent parts and works out sort of what makes them go. So this is what we're going to do. So a few laughs, a few tears, mostly tears, we think. You'll know this image. It's on the cover of the course booklet. This is Garrick being torn between tragedy and comedy. And it's an allegory, of course. David Garrick was a very, very famous Shakespearean actor. If you go to the Walker Art Gallery in town now, you can see Garrick as Richard III, where he's standing there in fear doing the fearful hand thing. And his hands are open. He said, "What? What can I do?" Tragedy is obviously pointing upwards, as you can see, because tragedy represents people as better than they are. Tragedy is a loftier thing than comedy, whereas comedy is kind of slutty looking, sort of not really covered up, whereas tragedy is wearing full dress and a knife, in case she just feels like sticking it in herself. Whereas comedy is often linked actually with sexual gratuity. If you actually read any ancient Greek comedy, the comedy of Aristophanes, it's filthy. They used to strap on huge prosthetic phalluses and run around like satyrs and things like that. What you'd usually have, you'd have a cycle of 3 tragedies plus a comedy for kind of comic relief at the end, in case you felt like slashing your wrists. So that's what you've got there. Sort of the comedy is more salacious, linked with love, lust, and sex, whereas tragedy is a loftier thing, more serious. We need to discuss liberal humanism first, though. This is that ism that you'll be starting on tomorrow. It's the first chapter in the Peter Barry book. Humanism in itself is the means whereby we actually have Aristotle's Poetics, because Aristotle's Poetics were lost for a long, long time. But in the Renaissance, a cultural project emerges, which is called humanism. And most people, again, humanism now is read or understood in a very vague way, but humanism had a specific meaning back in the Renaissance. Humanism was the process whereby people would look for lost classical texts or imitate classical texts which were already in existence. And you think, well, what's the point? Well, there were lessons to be learned in humanity, in morality, by reading the works of classical antiquity, and by acknowledging their difference. In the medieval period, the classics had still existed, or a large number of them had, but they were read through a primarily Christian framework. So you'd read Virgil's Aeneid, and you'd read it as one gigantic Christian allegory, not for its own sake. Whereas in the Renaissance, with humanism, you say, no, there are lessons to be learned from these classical texts which tell us something about humanity, not necessarily because they're read in a Christian way, but just because they're read in terms of what we are supposed to call the human condition, which over the next couple of weeks, when we look at Marxism, feminism, and post-colonialism, and structuralism, and post-structuralism, and historicism, and new criticism, you'll find that the human condition might not even exist. The world as we know it might not even exist, and we ourselves may not exist either when our eyes are closed. But this is something we're going to look at. Humanism, as a concept, posits a fundamental humanity which runs throughout time. It's something which transcends time. So, if you read Oedipus Rex, if you read Shakespeare, if you read works that were written hundreds, thousands of years ago, and you think, yeah, I know that feeling. I've thought that thought. I know what that feels like. And yet this person is living in a completely different culture to me. How can I have had the same idea? Well, it must be human nature. There must be something which is fixed within human nature. The confusing thing about liberal humanism is that on the one hand you have this human condition, you have human nature which underpins the centuries, which transcends time. And on the other you have this emphasis upon the individual. According to liberal humanism, we are all free liberal agents. We can fulfill our own destinies. We can do what we please. Again, a Marxist would say, no, that's not true. Class determines who you are. A feminist would say, no, it's not true. Your gender, or rather your sex, determines who you are. Post-colonialists would say, no, you have to consider race, and so on and so forth. Post-structuralists would say something incomprehensible, and we just nod. But this is what liberal humanism, it develops as a kind of a negative. So liberal humanism became current in the 70s, especially this is when structuralism and post-structuralism was really taking off, as a shorthand and in a hostile way of referring to the kind of criticism which held sway before theory. So liberal humanism is not just this concept of the human condition, it's a theoretical school, a critical school. The word liberal in this formulation roughly means not politically radical, and hence generally evasive and non-committal on political issues. Political criticism really takes off in the 70s and 80s. Humanism implies something similar. There is also the implication that liberal humanists believe in human nature as something fixed and constant, which great literature expresses. And that's that human nature, which keeps coming back. And usually the liberal humanist position is the one that most people take. Where we usually have a sense, yes, I am I, and I think these things. And other people have thought similar things, and it shows that there is something fundamental to humanity, because we like thinking of ourselves as special, as being humans, because otherwise we're just monkeys with clothes on. So comedy and tragedy. This is why we look at Aristotle, because he's part of the humanist project. You look into the past, and Aristotle's rules for comedy and tragedy, again, they emerge in the Renaissance, but they stay with us. And even in the 20th century, you get people like Arthur Miller writing Tragedy in the Common Man, in which he's trying to fight against Aristotle. You get Endgame, which in many ways is ripping up the real book of what comedy or tragedy should constitute, but he still can't quite escape it. So the object of imitation, mimesis, this is our first big term, are men in action, action being key here. And these men must be either of a higher or a lower type. The same distinction marks off tragedy from comedy, for comedy aims at representing men as worse, tragedy as better than in real life. This is where we distinguish. Apologies again for Aristotle's quite raging misogyny.